Hello, everyone. I will be talking about how to and how not to move your RBAC into Ory. My name is HC, lead at Ignite Procurement AS. I'd love to tell you more about me, but we're on a schedule, or rather behind a schedule, so let's get cracking. So RBAC, I asked an AI to give me a visual representation of what role-based access control is, and it's just about as clear as the average response from a sysadmin, right? No, I'm joking. We love you, sysadmins, we love you. But the concept is quite simple, right? You want a role to be a subset of permissions. Now, the implementation of RBAC is often quite complex. So you'll end up with a role being some user groups with some users in them, and they attain to some policies that will lead you to some object groups. Well, and they follow some more policies that gives you permissions to some data models that will allow you to access some objects, right? I realize this is policy role-based access control. But it's very complex often, and simplicity is key. So I added KISS, which I learned in like grade school. You know, keep it simple, stupid. This is definitely a good candidate for that. So we came from outer spaghetti. I was kindly asked to not mention what we came from, so I didn't. Our legacy solution was deprecated by the time I entered the company, and we used one permission per data model, which was automatically assigned. And as you can imagine, that leads to some rather saturated roles as the company grows and you get more objects and object types and so on. And good luck with the custom roles, right? When you have 666 objects and some IT manager in some companies trying to put up a custom role and he's like on his 580th permission and wondering, do we need this or not for this role, right? It gets convoluted fast, descending into chaos. So along came Ory, who were bleeding edge. I mean, still kind of is, even though it's getting used more by the day, as you saw by the graphs earlier. It was written in self-documenting Golang. Code is, as we all know, inherently self-documenting. The docs are also getting more and more documenting by the day, which is good. And it's open source, so I can see how things work under the hood. It's not like a black box, right? And it's very pick and choosy, so you can pick like Kratos for user management, you can use Hydra for SSO stuff, and Keto for permissions, Oathkeeper if you want to have something local like a token exchange or a proxy to make things easier. And the implementation is fairly simple, it's understandable, right? So it's not hard to use. I don't mean simple as in written simply, but it's not hard to use. So in our case, our RBAC is Keto. And it's an open source implementation of Zanzibar, which is Google's RBAC sort of model or protocol. Now, Zanzibar is a glorified key value store, and that is a good thing for simplicity and transparency and so on. So in Keto, roles is not actually a thing. Groups are. As you can see by the example, we grant groups a bunch of permissions. And then we can grant some people those groups again, and they will get all the permissions. It's fairly straightforward. So a group is a subset of permissions, or a superset. And a permission is a tuple. It's an object and a relation. Can I do this with that? Again, very straightforward, very simple. Now, about the how not to part that I mentioned. And I really should shorten this segment. We are, after all, behind schedule. Do not fuck around. Am I allowed to swear? Good. It's too late anyways, but good. So we kind of went into this guns blazing, right? We just wanted to have everything done by day one, ideally. And I had one dev who was doing a brilliant dev, by the way. He was doing the implementation of AD, like it wasn't Skim even then, it was some other sort of AD, translating roles from AD to Ory and back. And he was like, can I do this in C# because Microsoft has an SDK that I can use and that's easier? And I'm like, do you know C#? He says, yeah. Does anyone else here know C#? No. Does anyone else even have the dev environment for C#? No. Okay, but you're a good developer, you can do this, right? He moved to Australia, and lo and behold, 2 weeks after, the thing crashes and burns, and we just rewrote the thing from scratch. Nobody can be bothered to learn .NET when you haven't done it, right? We also had a dev who was assigned the entire front-end implementation of Ory. or our usage of Ory. And she showed up to a meeting one day saying, I live in Canada now, I'm in a different time zone, sorry about the short warning, I'm not sure I can continue on doing this, right? And we already had legacy code only months after sort of adapting it, right? Which is, it was a bit of a setback. So, I mean, this is one of those things that you shouldn't just do guns blazing, you know, it's fun to shoot from the hip, but it will bite you sometimes. Not invented here syndrome, I love not invented here, writing things from scratch is great, but in the particular case of auth, like authentication, authorization, just leave it to the guys who know what they're doing. You know, leverage that. Now, backwards compatibility is a necessary foot canon. I know that you have to be backwards compatible because you can't break your entire platform because you're going to use a new you know, third-party provider for authentication. So you sort of have to have it, but try to make the break as clean as possible. Like, we're still struggling years in with legacy, you know, backwards compatibility, like legacy stuff. Try not to duplicate functionality. Try not to duplicate data. Programmer joke, truth plus truth equals truth actually returns false, unless truth is 0, but let's not talk about that. It doesn't really matter. So you don't want to have two separate truths, you want to have a single source of truths, and maintaining two is an absolute headache, and the same goes for functionality. If you have tokens here and tokens there, or you have like 5 different clients for doing, you know, just regular session checking or whatever, it ends up being an absolute pain. So just try to avoid it. Now, about the how-to part. So a role is a group of permissions, and a user has a role that has permissions, as I've tried to draw for you here. So Ignite Me, the user, has some other role, and I'm also the almighty admin. Now, the almighty admin is allowed to do all these things, and when I'm asking my file service, can me, or Ignite Me, the user, write confidential files, it will ask Keto, can he write confidential files? And because I have that role, I can. That is how simple it should be. And that's all the layers of abstraction that you need. And then you're golden. So this is obvious, but look up the permission and not the role. You shouldn't ask, is this guy an admin? You should always ask, can this guy write the confidential files, right? Otherwise, you end up creating a super admin role, and then you have to, you know, recode a whole bunch of things because you're checking if someone has a role. That's not how you're supposed to use it. Caching is good. I know, I can hear your collective groan as I mentioned caching, but for some things it is good, particularly in like a microservice architecture where you have 20 microservices and they might be requests across to each other, and you end up with one front-end request doing 20 separate session checks, you know, for each microservice and so on. You might want to add a cache and reuse like a session or some other data that you've fetched, for at least for a short time, to not sort of DDoS Ory every time you use them, right? Also sharing, again, I know, but sharing. So you might not want to share a database or share a package even, or share a cache, because, you know, it's microservices, you want the domains to have clear boundaries and you want to have clean architecture. That's fine. So at least share like a common microservice to do some of these things for you. So you have, you know, uniformity and homogeneousness through your cluster or your stack. For multi-tenancy, don't mind if I do. We've solved this by prefixing the user, the subject ID for each permission. You can also solve this by using separate projects for each tenant, and they all have their pros and cons. We went with this to avoid the administrative overhead of running separate projects, mostly because we have maybe 200-300 tenants, I don't know, with maybe 4 or 5 users in each, so it would be a huge sort of administrative overhead for very few users in each project. So we went for just prefixing instead. So Ignite Me, the user, can have some other roles than Ory Me, the user, who's just a puny read-only. So if Ory Me, the user, still with my identity, kinda, were to make the same file service request, I would be denied access, obviously, because it's a different identifier. So also leverage the Ory Slack. I've been there a lot. Some of you might even know my name from the Ory Slack. And I've gotten loads of help in the Ory Slack from Ory themselves and also from other adopters of Ory, right? There are some skilled people there who can help you out with stuff if you get stuck or wonder how to solve something, right? So that's a very good resource. And for the result, with some mandatory pictures of my code, because it's after all a tech conference, the result looks something like this. Oh, nice, someone helped me out with layouts, that's kind of you. So you want to manually or programmatically maintain what the roles are. You can also probably do both. If you do it programmatically, it's very easy to sort of allow custom roles and have like systems in place to create your own roles and have administrators of other companies create their own roles. You can also have them manually in like your own type of file, or use OPL, which is like Ory's permission language. Custom roles should still be easy though, so try to avoid like 1,000 different permissions per role, and try to keep like things clear and concise, obviously. Use the namespacing for microservices or domains. That's at least what we've done. So if you have like a file handling microservice, that will use the files domain, right? And if you have like a contracts microservice, that's the contracts domain, and so on. So you get a clear sort of distinguished line between these sectors of consumers of Ory and the roles. Now, objects are entirely abstract. They just need to make sense. An object is basically just a string. So me personally, I'm a big fan of using general as the object, and then the request to Ory will look something like, can this user generally read stuff in the contracts namespace, for example, right? Which makes very much sense to a human being trying to understand how that permission check works. And the same goes for relations. They're entirely abstract. They're just strings. You just need them to make sense. So I'm a big fan of read, write, execute, because, you know, Linux and Unix and stuff. But you can also have like edit or view or whatever you think makes sense, as long as it's readable, right? And in the end, you should end up with something that's manageable and readable and understandable for pretty much anyone who uses it, including the administrators of your own user interface. So our user interface looks like this. I've even taken screenshots where I don't have access to edit the roles in that for that particular tenant. And the top right picture is our current sort of hierarchy. And you might notice that it's very flat. Now, you would be able to say that an editor is just a viewer that can do some more things, and then an admin is an editor that can do some more things, right? And that might seem tempting because it's very sort of hierarchical and nice, but it can also it's easy to shoot yourself in the foot, right? It gets entangled fast. So, because you might think, you know, this viewer should not be allowed to read public anymore, and you remove that, and all of a sudden the admin can't read public anymore either because of the hierarchy, right? So try to avoid that and just keep it as simple as you can when moving over to this sort of hierarchy. And for my final words, I will reply on Slack. I will share my code, just ask. I would open source it, but as at least you Ory guys know, it's a high overhead for maintaining open source code. And I have limited hours in the day, as do the other developers that I work with. But I will share it, like it's not a secret, so just ask me if you want some code. And I will also answer your questions if you have any.
That's a great presentation. I like that. My question to you has to do with how you managed to transition from your old authentication system to Kratos. Because in my experience, one of the issues you have is that you have an entire set of users that are already using your system. Change to Ory, and most of the time the dynamics have changed a little bit, like how they get password resets done and all that. How did you get those users transitioned with?
Yeah, we actually did multiple things. The first idea was to just do the switch sort of backend, and then have the users be asked to retype their password, right? And then get assigned a new Ory user, and then have a script in place to give them their permissions back. And that was deemed too much hassle for the user. So we asked someone in Ory, I can't remember who did it, but we sent you guys a file that you put into your database at some point, and it worked. And then we wrote some scripts afterwards to sort of transfer users and roles to Ory. The bigger issue is getting rid of the old one, right? Because you still have code that relies on the old one, and we're actually still working on older code that still uses older permissions to get those moved over to actually ask for the new ones, because they're still connecting to other backends and so on, right? But we were pretty scrappy about it, really. Like we just basically took our users from here, ran them through a process, some scripts, and then put them into Ory. And then, the real work was rewriting the code that actually consumed the users and permissions, right? That is a bigger task. And if you want like a one-shot solution to that, I'm sorry, I don't have it. Like, it's just a lot of work to rewrite the code that has to use a new backend.